neighborhood and use this small farm of maybe 15, 20 homes to focus your energies on, because we've seen this work in other areas to good success. And it's a great software program that Robert his company has just developed, and he's going to be our program next month, and he'll go over that. But it's available now. Talk to him if you want that software program. Okay, so let's get into our program. I'm really pleased to have Gov Hutchinson here from C.A.R. Legal. Gov Hutchinson is Vice President of C.A.R. He's the Assistant General Counsel of C.A.R. He's been with California Association of REALTORS for over 35 years. He manages the C.A.R.'s member legal services. I think we've all used the legal hotline at some point in our careers. He manages that. He also trains and supervises the other hotline attorneys. Gov graduated from Princeton University and earned his Juris Doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania. Bless you. He's also a master instructor of the educational division of C.A.R. Gov Hutchinson, thank you. It's an honor to have you with us. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. You can hear me, right? Everybody can hear me? All right. Yes. Good to be here. Give you a legal update. Can you believe it's been a year of this we've had to live through? 13 months actually going on. One thing I can say about realtors is you've been extremely flexible the last 13 months trying to comply with everything. And I think big tip I have is you're gonna have to be flexible a little bit longer, but there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel in a couple of ways. So I'm gonna talk about COVID stuff, but I'm also gonna talk about not COVID stuff. And you can take if you have any questions, you can just put them in the chat, or I guess later you can raise your hand. I'm not going to show any slides or anything like that. Just going to talk. By the way, let me comment on the last couple of things you just saw, the videos. You know that story about the seller who wouldn't move in Riverside County? That's upsetting a lot of people. Well, point number one is, that can always happen, right? Forget COVID. Anytime you're in a sale, how do you know the seller's going to leave? You never really know till they leave, right? So what do you do in a normal situation if the seller won't leave? Do you call the police and say, get this trespasser off of my house? Chances are the police are going to say, nah, that's a civil matter. We can't handle it. So you have to do an eviction. You always have to do an eviction to get rid of a seller. I think that news show was slightly misleading. The reason they've had a hard time getting the sellers out of that house is not because of COVID directly. In other words, the sellers in that case, they signed a contract to leave. Failing to leave after signing a contract is always grounds to evict. The eviction moratorium doesn't enable them to legally stay. You know what the problem is? The problem is, remember the courts were closed for so long, and then they finally opened up. They are so backlogged with evictions. They're backlogged with unlawful detainers. So they're just catching up. So it is COVID related because the courts wouldn't have been closed without COVID. But nevertheless, don't get the impression that because of the eviction moratorium, the sellers don't have to leave. The problem is the courts are just backed up. Evictions are finally happening though, and these poor buyers are going to eventually be able to get those sellers out of there. In other words, the eviction moratorium isn't protecting those sellers. It's the backed up courts, which is also caused by COVID because the courts were closed, okay? And the other thing about those letters, remember, I think that was a good summary of it. It's not that the letters are illegal, but if I'm a seller, I don't want them. Because if I get the letter, I can be set up, I can be sued, I can be accused of bias. Whereas if I never got the letter, I say, I didn't know what race they were. I didn't know they had kids. I didn't know what they did for a living. I didn't know what religion they were. How would I know that? But if I got the letter, I can't deny that I knew that. You see what I'm saying? So it's not like it's illegal. It's just, it adds to the seller's potential liability. Why would you want to do that, right? And when you're looking at multiple offers, you're supposed to be focusing on the objective criteria, right? I mean, how much did they offer? How much is their down payment? What is their contingency removal thing? And you can look at the objective criteria, you can look at their income and their credit score and stuff like that, but you just can't look at their personal character. You shouldn't be looking at their personal characteristics. And these love letters indicate their personal characteristics. That's the whole point. All right. Let me talk about a couple things before we get any further. Everyone wants to know what's the latest with COVID. And the answer is nothing has changed yet. You've noticed that, I don't know if you follow these things, you know, all these areas move from one tier to another. And people say, great, my county has moved from orange tier, you know, to blue tier to orange. They've moved into a new tier. Does that affect real estate? That does not affect real estate at all. Not one bit. Real estate has its own separate rules. The good news is you're essential. So you've always been able to do your job, but there are restrictions on the way you do your job, which you're all familiar with. We at C.A.R. are pushing very hard. I think we're going to get a meeting with the governor very soon to try to convince them to open up some of these things. I mean, maybe open houses should be in a modified form. Maybe all these cleaning protocols shouldn't be required or not the same way. I mean, if other businesses can open up, logically, real estate should open up as well. But the point is, it hasn't done it yet. We will keep you posted. We are pushing for it, but it's not affected by what tier you're in. Did you hear the latest thing the governor says on June 15th or something? Maybe all the tiers are going to go. It's going to be almost business as usual with some restrictions. Well, hopefully we can convince him by June 15th that real estate, that includes real estate, right? I mean, that includes opening up real estate. But for now, nothing has changed. You got the PED forms, one buying party at a time, wear the masks, no traditional open houses, wipe down the property between showings. Everything you've been doing since last July is still in effect for now, okay? Sorry about that, but that's just the way it is. There's actually one new thing this year, which affects real estate offices. I could see from the video that your office is open, which is good. Or at least it's open for staff. I don't know if you open it up for clients or agents from other offices, but that's fine. That's legal. If you do that, though, you remember you always have to, if outsiders come into the office, you have to keep track of them.
Wow.
And the reason you have to keep track of them is, let's say someone comes into your office, make them wear a mask when they're in the office. And then a couple of days later, they say, oh, you know, I was in your office a couple of days ago. I just tested positive for COVID. We know what your responsibility as an office owner is to notify anyone else who was in the office that you're aware of during that person's infectious period, which begins 2 days before the positive test and continues to 10 days after the positive test. That's why you keep track of who comes into your office. So, you know, someone said, I was in your office on this Friday, I tested positive. Yesterday, Thursday, I was in your office on Wednesday. Well, let's see, Wednesday, day before the test, that was within their, you know, the positive infectious period. So you're gonna have to notify anyone else who was in the office that day, plus going forward, if anyone was in the office after that person's test. And once you find out about that test, you should probably do some cleaning of the office, but you're still gonna have to notify anyone else who comes in the next 8 or 9 days. So they're probably not gonna wanna come into the office in the next 8 or 9 days. You never know. The other thing is the same thing for people who work there. Let's say some agent or employee in the office tests positive, someone who works from the office. I don't know if everyone's working from the office or not, but someone who works in the office tests positive. Well, now you have to notify not just visitors who were in the office during that person's infectious period, but all the other agents who work there, right? All the other agents, you got to figure out who was in the office at the same time this person was during their infectious period. And if that's the case, you have to notify them with what this happened. And if it's an independent contractor like an agent, that's all you got to do. But if you have an employee, a W-2 employee who works from your office, and someone else in the office gets sick, you have to give them special notifications. We have a Q&A on this on our website called AB 685, notification to employees, or you can call the legal hotline and we can walk you through it. This is if someone in your office gets sick and you have employees as opposed to independent contractors who work from the office. California law requires certain notifications to be given to these employees, okay? More complicated stuff you got to deal with, hopefully not too much longer, okay? All right. Let's talk about not COVID stuff. What else is going on out there that you need to know? Well, there are three things, three big laws everyone needs to know about. And there are a couple little laws, I'll mention two. The three big laws everyone needs to know about, number one, and hopefully you know about these already. One of them is the home hardening disclosure form. The way I like to put it is this. For the C.A.R, California has not had a new disclosure form for about 15 years. So for the last 15 years, if some realtor asks me, I got a listing, what are the mandatory disclosure forms I got to think about? My answer always would have been, well, first order an NHD report, right? That covers a lot. In addition to the NHD report, there are four other things you have to think about. The transfer disclosure statement, TDS, the seller property questionnaire, SPQ, the lead paint form if it's a pre-78 house, and the fourth thing are those four disclosure booklets you must give to the buyer. You can either send them a link through zip forms. You can, sometimes the NHG report includes them, a link. You have to send them the actual booklet. You got to send them a link to the booklet or give them the actual booklet, whatever you want to do. So I will say NHD +4. Well, now it's NHD +5. There's a fifth form you have to do. The home hardening, the home fire hardening disclosure, form HHDA. Now here's the thing about this form. It's not required every sale. It is only required if your listing is in a very high or high fire hazard zone and the house was built before 2010. So that's not every listing you have, is it? No, only very high or high fire hazard severity zone built before 2010, which means every time you take a listing now, you have to figure out two things. What type of zone are we in and when was the house built? Well, all of us in California, there's four possibilities. We're either not in a fire zone like me in Culver City, or you're in a moderate fire zone, or you're in a high fire zone, or you're in a very high. The form is only required in the last two. If your house is not in a fire zone, not required. If it's in a moderate fire zone, not required. But if you're in a high or very high, form required if the house is built before 2010. Well, how do I figure out what type of zone I'm in? This is why we have NHD companies. The NHD report itself has two fire zones on it. One says very high, one says wildland fire area with substantial risk of forest fire. All right. If neither box is checked, you're not in a zone, don't worry about it. If the very high fire zone box is checked, obviously you're in a very high zone, you need the form if it's built before 2010. What if the very high fire severity zone box is not checked, but the second box is the wildland fire areas box? If that's checked, you're either in a high or a moderate. But how do I know which one? Because I know the form is only required if I'm in the high, not the moderate. I know some offices are just providing the form anytime you're in any type of fire zone, which is fine. But if you only want to give the form if it's actually required and the box on the NHD for wildland fire area is checked, then you have to go one step further and actually talk to the NHD rep and say, which zone am I in here? And they can find out and they will find out. So in other words, they're not required to put it on the cover page of the report, but they have that information and they can provide that information. So then they tell you, oh yeah, you're only in a moderate zone. Well, then you know the form is not required. But if you're in a high zone, the form is required if it's built before 2010. You know why that's the case? properties built after 2010 were built under the new fire building code. So if they were in a high or very high zone, they were built a certain way, no wood roof, no landscaping within 5 feet of the house, etc. But if I'm buying a house built before 2010 in one of these fire zones, it may not be as safe as it could be. So the seller has to fill out this form and actually answer 6 questions and tell me what wood roof or not, if they have combustible landscaping within 5 feet of the house, if they have single pane windows rather than dual pane windows, if they have gutter covers that are not made of non-combustible material. So the seller tells me these things. They say, yep, I got a wood roof. I still got a wood roof. I say to the seller, I don't want to buy your house with a wood roof. You know what the seller can say? Then don't buy a house. The seller is not required to upgrade anything. The seller is only required to disclose to the buyer what they know about their house if it was built before 2010 and it was in one of these zones. Okay? All right. Guess what? This form that just came out January is going to be tweaked end of June because there's a new law coming out. This one just about fire hardening. There's a new law coming out regarding defensible space. So there's going to be a new part of this form disclosing the rules on defensible space. This law doesn't kick in until July 1st. So the form isn't going to change until late June. The point is disclosure. Seller's just going to have to provide it to the buyer if the house is built before 2010 in one of these zones. But just the form is going to change end of June and to talk about defensible space because that's a requirement starting on July 1st. All right. So that's big law number 1 everyone needs to know about. Law number 2 that everyone should know about is Prop 19. Prop 19 took effect last Thursday, April 1st. And everyone should just be aware of this, that if you're over 55 or severely disabled or the victim of a wildfire, you can move anywhere in California. You can take the property tax you're paying on your current home, move anywhere in California, and take your property tax with you. Which this means is, you bought a house a long time ago for $200,000. So you're paying property tax based on $200,000. It's now worth $700,000. You want to sell and buy a new house, but you don't want your property taxes to go way up. Well, good news. If you're over 55, disabled, or a wildfire victim, you can take the property tax basis you currently have, which is based on $200,000, go anywhere in California. If you buy a house, so let's say your current one is worth $700,000, right? You buy another house worth $700,000 or less, the property tax you're paying on the old house is going to be the same as the property tax you're paying on the new house. What if I buy a more expensive house? Well, in that case, if you buy a more expensive house, you have to add the difference between the purchase price of the new one and the sales price of the old one to the property tax basis. So let's say, getting back to my example, bought the house for $200,000. You're paying property tax based on that. It's now worth $700,000. You sell your $700,000 and buy one for $800,000. What's the difference between $800,000 and $700,000? $100,000. You add that to the $200,000 you're currently paying. So your property tax on the new house wouldn't be based on an $800,000 value. It would be based on a $300,000 value. Up until April 1st, you couldn't do that. Up until April 1st, you had to buy a cheaper house. Up until April 1st, you had to stay in the county that you're in or a few other counties. And prior to April 1st, you could only do this one time in your life. Now you can do it 3 times, even if you've already done it once. You can move anywhere in California and you can buy a more expensive house. Danny, wildfire victim simply means their house was damaged by a wildfire. Okay, that's a wildfire victim.
But it could be any kind of damage. It doesn't have to be total destruction.
Exactly. So that's the basic rule of that. Now there's a question that's a very good question. And that is, okay, well, first of all, the basic question is, you sell the old one, you have 2 years to buy the new one. You can actually buy the new one first, and then you got 2 years to sell the old one. As long as you do the two transactions within 2 years, you're good. But what if I'm over 55 or disabled, and I sold my original house February. I sold it last November. I sold it last September. But I haven't bought a new one yet. Even though I did it last year, I did it a while ago, I'm still within the 2 years. So even though Prop 19 didn't take effect until April 1st, I haven't bought the new one yet. So since I sold the old one before April 1st, and I want to buy a new one that's either more expensive or it's in a different place, can I still take advantage of Prop 19 and transfer it? We think the answer is yes. We have sponsored legislation that is moving through the government that, if it gets passed, would say that. It looks like it's going to get passed. It has not gotten passed yet. By the way, remember, if you're staying within the same county or moving to LA, Ventura, Orange, Riverside, or San Bernardino counties, it doesn't matter what date it is, you can move to a less expensive house right now. But the question is, can I transfer my property tax base to a more expensive house, or can I do it outside of those counties? And the answer is that's Prop 19. You can definitely do it now. The question is, if I did one side before April 1st and the other side after, can I still take advantage of Prop 19? We think the answer is yes. As soon as we get a definite answer, we'll be telling every realtor in the state. Okay, so stay tuned for that. Okay, all right. Third important law every realtor should know about is back to COVID. It's the whole eviction moratorium that I was mentioning before. Now, there's good news and bad news here for landlords. The eviction moratorium is in effect till July, 3 more months. Will it get extended beyond that? Nobody knows. I'm hoping not. It all depends on the virus and how things are between now and then, right? But as of now, what this means is you cannot evict someone if the reason they're not paying rent is COVID. But even those people have to pay 25% of the rent. What if someone's not paying rent, but it's got nothing to do with COVID? You can evict them right now. Remember what I said before, though, the courts are backed up, but they're slowly catching up. So evictions are happening. But if the reason they're not paying is COVID, then you can't evict them till July, although they do have to pay 25%. What if they don't pay the 25%? Can I evict them now? No, you still can't evict them till July. What if they have a COVID reason, they pay the 25%? Can I evict them in July? Well, you can evict them if they don't pay the July rent. But you can't evict them for not paying that back rent. You can never evict them. Once the eviction moratorium is over, they have to pay all the rent going forward. But the back rent that they owe, as long as they've been paying the 25%, you can never evict them for not paying the back rent if they had a legitimate COVID reason for not paying. Well, how do I know if my tenant has a COVID reason or not? The only way to know is to try to evict them. But between now and July, you don't send them the normal 3-day notice. You got to send them the COVID 15-day notice to pay or quit. And what comes attached to that form is this declaration of financial distress. If they sign that under penalty of perjury, saying they have a COVID reason they can't pay their rent, you can't question it. You have to take their word for it. But they do have to pay 25%. Okay. What about the other 75% that they owe me going back a year? Well, starting July 1st, you can sue them for the money. Starting August 1st, you can sue them in small claims court for all the money, even if it's more than 10,000. But here's the good news. Effective last March 15th, 3 weeks or so now, there's this state rental assistance program. And landlords are eligible. They're starting to get money now. Landlords are eligible for government money. You pay your taxes, you should get this money, government money that's been allocated to you, to California, to your county, wherever you are. And this money is for landlords who are owed back COVID rent. There's a website, it's called housingiskey.com. That's where you go to find out how you apply to get this money, okay? You go to the website, you look up your county, it'll show you how to apply. The couple of strings attached, of course, are you're only eligible to get this money if the tenant who's not paying the rent, their income is less than 80% of the area median income. What the heck is the area median income? That's the county. Whatever county you're in, what's the median income in that county? You know, for a household of 1 person, 2 person, 3 person, 4 person, 80% of that, that's a number. Where do I get that number? Well, we have a Q&A on our website. It's called the Eviction Moratorium Extension and State Rental Assistance, SB 91. It has a link that can show you, take you to your county and say, okay, in your county, household of 3, 80% of median income is this number. And a lot of times the tenants who aren't paying rent, it's because their income has gone down. So there's a pretty good likelihood your tenant's income is less than 80% of the year. If that's your tenant, you can apply for the money. The tenant has to apply also. They're going to put down what their income is, right? Anyway, assuming the tenant is eligible, the state's going to say, oh, okay, that tenant, you're eligible, that tenant owes you $30,000. We're going to give you $24,000. Because here's the other string attached. They're only going to give you 80% of what is owed. You have to forgive the other 20%. What if the landlord says, I don't want to forgive anything, I want all of my back rent? Well, then you're not going to get the government money. In that case, what you're going to get is 25% to pay for the tenant's minimum. But you can then sue the tenant for all the money they owe you. But you're not going to get any government money. Now, this is with the first round of money that happened last year, believe it or not. As you probably know, if you follow these things, there's new $1.9 trillion coming, which is going to include more landlord money. And maybe that'll cover any landlord who doesn't get paid the first time around. We don't know yet, okay? By the way, another thing related to this, let's say you're not a landlord, but you're having trouble paying your mortgage, or maybe you are a landlord. You're having trouble paying your mortgage because of COVID. Not only is there landlord assistance money coming, there is mortgage assistance money coming as well. That's coming May 1st from the federal government. We don't know the details yet. As soon as we know, we will tell you. But you'll be able to apply and of course, there's another protection for property owners now is, as you probably know, if you can't pay your mortgage in California because of COVID, you're entitled to forbearance. The lender has to, usually eligible to go into some program where your mortgage payments right now, you don't have to pay them now, you pay them at the end. But this mortgage assistance money is coming, maybe it's going to help some people so they don't have to pay it back at all because of the COVID. Well, stay tuned for that. Let's get back to rentals. So that's the rental assistance program. What if I have a tenant? It's not a question of paying rent. It's a question of they're not letting me show the property, or they have pets they shouldn't have, or they have subtenants they shouldn't have, or they're damaging the property, creating a nuisance, criminal activity. You can evict them right now. You have to use the special COVID 3-day notice to cure breach of covenant or quit. You don't use the normal one. All the COVID forms are in one place on zip form. You have a problem, call the hotline. But you can evict them right now. Problem is, of course, courts are backed up. They're catching up. But for realtors, here's the really important one. Can I evict the tenant right now? They haven't done anything wrong. They're paying the rent. It's not a question of that. The question is, I want to sell the house. They're in the house. I want to kick them out so I can sell the house. Can I evict that tenant? And the answer is, depends on where you are. If you're in LA County, no. If you're in a couple of places in the Bay Area, no. If you're in Orange County or if you're in anywhere else in Southern California, yes. You have 4 legitimate reasons to evict a tenant right now. In other words, to evict a tenant right now for no fault, you have to have just cause. Normally, you don't, on a single family home, you don't need a reason to evict. Duplex, you don't need a reason to evict. Apartment building newer than 15 years old, don't need a reason to evict. From now until July, in all residential properties in California, you need a reason to evict. Number one, they're not paying the rent. It's not COVID related. Number two, they're violating something else. Or number three, they're not doing anything wrong, but there are 4 reasons you can evict. Number one, you can move in the house yourself. You know, I want to move in my kid, my grandkid, my parent, or my grandparent. If any of those people want to move in, that's grounds to evict right now. But you can't just move in for a week and then leave, kick out the tenant and then leave, get a new tenant. No, you got to stay there. Generally, for at least a year is considered good faith. Second, if the house has mandatory remodels that need to be done because it was damaged or something, that's grounds to evict the tenant. But just because you want to fix it up to sell it, that's not grounds to evict the tenant. Third, you can take the house off the rental market. Kick the tenant out because you're not going to rent it to anybody. Of course, if the tenant's on a lease, you got to wait till the end of the lease. But assuming it's month to month, you can give them 60-day notice. You got to leave because I'm not going to rent it to anybody. Well, that's great. Can't I just do that and then sell the house? Well, yeah, you can do that, but then the buyer can't rent it out either. How long? 2 years. Well, maybe the buyer doesn't want to rent it out. Fine, you can do that. But fortunately, there's a 4th, even better reason to evict a tenant right now. And that is if you got a single family house that's tenant occupied and you get a buyer in contract, they sign a purchase contract that says they're going to live there and it's accepted. As soon as you get the accepted offer, you can evict the tenant. You're not taking it off the rental market. You're not fixing it up. You're not moving in yourself. You have a buyer who wants to occupy, who has signed a contract saying they're going to occupy. And by the way, they don't have to commit to any length of time to live there. Okay. So buyer signs a contract, then you can give the tenant the notice. And you don't have to give them relocation either. Okay. You can just do this. Unless you're in LA County, which unfortunately is 25% of the state's population. Landlords in LA County cannot evict until July. The only time you can evict in LA County is if they're not paying rent for a not COVID reason or they're violating certain terms of the lease. Okay. But if you're not in LA County, those are the rules. Call the hotline if you have questions. There are forms for this. We have a Q&A with links in it to everything, all the information you need. Check that out. Okay. So those are the 3 big laws. There's one more thing. Forgot one more thing. There's an important new form that goes along with that. It's called the Tenant Relief Act 2, the Notice of Tenant Relief Act, NTRA 2. A year ago, if you were a landlord, hopefully you knew that a year ago you were required to give your tenants, if they had a COVID issue, this form called the Notice of Tenant Relief Act, the NTRA. Here we are a year later. You now have to give them the second version of this form, the NTRA 2. But you only have to give this form to your tenant if the tenant is behind on their rent because of COVID. You don't have to give this form to every tenant, just the ones behind on their rent for COVID. But you got to give them this form. If you don't give them this form, you're not going to be able to evict them in July. And you might not even be able to sue them for the back rent in July. So if you haven't done it already, brand new form, give to all residential tenants. You should have done it before, before March 1st, but better late than never, NTRA 2. So basically, we've talked about the 3 new forms that you all got to know about. Number 1, the fair housing form, right? The fair housing form. We talked about, because it mentioned that stuff about buyer love letters. You've seen the form, just make your clients sign it so they can't come back later and say, nobody told me that no one told me that I couldn't do this or that. Yeah, you did. We gave you a form, you signed. Second form I mentioned is the HHDA, the home fire hardening disclosure, required if you're listing a home in a very high or high fire zone, and it's built before 2010. And the third mandatory form I told you about is the NTRA 2. All residential landlords must give it to their tenants if they're behind on the rent because of COVID. Those are the only 3 new forms that have come out in the last 6 months or so. But of course, you still have to use all the special COVID forms, the PED form, right? All those forms, you got to keep using them. But other than that, and you got to use the special 15-day notice to pay or quit form. You got to use the special notice to terminate 60-day notice form. There's a special eviction form for all these situations I mentioned. And those are sort of new forms, but they've been tweaked recently, but they've been around for about a year. 3 new forms that just came out. So I told you about 3 new laws and 3 new forms. Is there anything else you really need to know right now? Couple things. For one thing, there's other laws that are worth talking about. One is interesting law regarding homeowner associations. Can an HOA tell me I can't rent out my property to somebody else? Up until this year, they could. Now an HOA has to allow at least 25% of the people who live in the association to rent out their property. And by the way, this means they're allowed to rent out their whole property. If they just rent out first of all, you absolutely have the right to rent out your garage or your back unit. HOAs can't stop you from that. And if you're just renting out your garage or your back, that doesn't even count towards the 25%. 25% have the right to rent out their entire property. And the HOA can't put unreasonable restrictions on who you rent to. I mean, can they say you can only rent to single people? No. Can they say you can only rent to family members? No. Can they say you can only rent to people over 55? Only if it's a senior citizen complex. Can they tell you no short-term rentals? Yes. They absolutely can prohibit rentals of less than 30 days. Absolutely. Don't have to allow that. Okay? So that's the latest rule on HOAs. There's this crazy new law on foreclosures, which will probably surprise you. And there's already legal challenges to it. It may not survive, but it might. Regarding foreclosures. Remember there was a foreclosure moratorium? Well, that's over, although there's still FHA, VA foreclosure moratorium. So foreclosures are happening. But remember, if you can't pay your mortgage because of COVID, you're probably entitled to forbearance where you don't have to, they can't foreclose on you for not making those payments. But let's say it's a regular foreclosure. So there's a property in foreclosure and there's an auction and you want to go to the auction. And so you go to the auction, you make a bid and you win. You're the successful bidder at a foreclosure auction. Up until this year, that meant, guess what? That's your property. Not so fast. Now, if you foreclose on a tenant-occupied residential property, the tenant has 45 days after the auction to meet the winning bid price. If they can somehow come up with the money and close the deal, the same amount of money that the person who won the auction, then the tenant can get the property. Now, this is only if the person foreclosing doesn't want to live there. if the person foreclosing intends to occupy, it's their property on the day of the sale. They have to sign a form saying, yep, I'm going to occupy. But if an investor is foreclosing, they are not going to live in this property, and there's a tenant in the property that they just foreclosed on. Well, not only do you have to give that tenant 90-day notice to leave, but the tenant has 45 days to actually buy the property themselves at that price, if they can come up with the money and close it in 45 days. What if there's no tenant on the property and I foreclose on this residential property as an investor? Well, guess what? It's still not necessarily yours, because anyone in California who wants to live in that property can submit a bid within 15 days after the auction, and the bid has to be for a higher amount of money than the winning bid. So let's say you go to the auction and you bought it for $500,000, but you're not going to live there. You're an investor. So someone who wants to own and occupy this house, they have 15 days after the auction, they submit a bid. Let's say they submit a bid $525. Let's say there's more than one person that submits a bid who wants to live there, the highest bid, whatever it is. And they have to sign an affidavit. I swear I'm going to live there. If there's a bid, the winning bidder now has 30 more days to close the deal. But if they're successfully submit a bid within 15 days after the auction, they have the highest bid, and then they can close it within a total of 45 days from the auction, they get the property. The bottom line is this: if you foreclose on a residential property and you're not going to live there, you don't really know for 45 days whether that's your property or not. That's a big change. Let me tell you one more good change, positive change. Everyone in California now has a higher homestead protection. A homestead protection is the protection when you own your own home. It's the amount of money that is protected from any judgment creditor against you. Last year, everyone in California, if you owned your own house, your homestead was either $75,000, $100,000, or $175,000. If you were single, it was $75,000. If you're head of a household of 2 or more, it was $100,000. If you're over 65, it was $175,000. Meaning, let's say me last year, head of a household, so I had a $100,000 homestead. And let's say I owe my lender $100,000 on my mortgage. That's a total of $200,000, right? My homestead plus secured lien. Last year, if someone sued me for $400,000 and got a judgment, they could foreclose on the house, because they would foreclose, pay me my $100,000, pay off my loan $100,000, they keep the rest. Now, last year, if they got a judgment against me $175,000, they couldn't touch me because they wouldn't have enough to pay off my homestead and the lien, because I had a protection of $100,000. Well, guess what? My homestead has now moved from $100,000 to $600,000. Everyone in California's homestead now doesn't depend on your status. Everyone has the same homestead. Your homestead on your property is either the median sales price of a single family home in your county last year, or 600,000, whichever is less. I live in LA County. Single family home median price last year was over 600. So my homestead is 600. So let's say I have $600 homestead. I owe my bank 100,000. Someone sues me for 699,000. They win. They get a judgment. They can't touch my house because they don't have enough to pay me my 600,000 and pay the my credit, my secured loan 100,000. So everyone has a bigger homestead. And you know what? You don't even have to record a declaration of homestead to get this protection. It's automatic. But I would recommend anyone does record a declaration of homestead, because if you do that, you go to the recorder's office and do that, you know what? You're also protected. You're not just protected from a foreclosure. You're protected if you voluntarily sell your house, even with a judgment lien out there. because if you've recorded a declaration of homestead, that lien won't attach to the proceeds of the sale as long as you buy a new house within 6 months. So that's good. But you're protected from the foreclosure even without doing that. Okay. So those are some interesting new laws. Is there anything else I want to share with you today? You know, I don't know about you guys, but we're hearing multiple offers, multiple offers, multiple offers. And a couple of things keep coming up that are worth talking about. One of them is escalation clauses where people make offers. My offer is $5,000 more than the next best offer you get. Is that a legal offer? Answer, yes. But it's a risk. What's the risk of writing that offer? Well, one risk is your offer is $5,000 more than the next best offer, and someone else makes an offer like $300,000 over the fair market value. Your offer is now $5,000 more than that. But that's okay, right? I can still get out of the deal if I have a contingencies, but we see people make non-contingent offers with an escalation clause, which is very risky because now you don't have a way to get out of the deal and the seller accepts your offer $5,000 more than this crazy offer and you don't buy it, they keep your deposit. So that's one risk. Another risk is if you submit an offer X amount over the best offer, anyone, the next best offer, but somebody else also submits an offer like that. You know what the courts say? The courts say those two offers cancel themselves out and neither one's a legit offer. So you don't want to take that. So in other words, you can do it, but understand the risk. The other thing we're seeing is people writing things like, because appraisals are behind and lagging, say, buyer will pay $20,000 above the appraised amount. What does this mean? Does this mean that, you know, if the appraisal is $50,000 less than the market value, the seller, by accepting that offer, has to reduce the sales price to that amount? I guarantee that's what the buyer thinks, and I guarantee the seller doesn't think it means that. So we see problems happening all the time. Or does the buyer really mean by that? What they're really trying to say is, my property is contingent on my offer is contingent on the property appraising, not at the purchase price, but my offer is contingent on the property appraising, you know, up to 20,000 below the or above the appraised amount. The point is, when people start doing this, they need to clarify exactly what they mean, because we've seen people write these buyer and seller do these deals, and they don't agree on what the language actually means. So what we're advising people is, buyers, if they're trying to write that into their offer, they should basically, I hate to tell you this, talk to a lawyer to help them draft an addendum to really make sure that it clearly means what it says, and everyone understands what it means, and the seller understands and the buyer understands. It almost takes like a one-page addendum to make this clear. Or of course, the realtor can call the legal hotline. We can help you with it, but it's almost the level of complexity to do it right. They should probably get their own lawyer to do it. Okay, so those are a couple of things we see come up all the time. We hear all the complaints that I submitted an offer, I didn't get a response. You know you're entitled to a response, right? Well, you're not entitled to a response from the seller, but you're entitled to the listing agent telling you under penalty of perjury when they presented your offer. Or they might tell you, my seller instructed me not to present any offers under 500. Or my seller instructed me to present all offers on Saturday. It's not Saturday yet. But the listing agent has to respond to your question, and they have to give you an honest answer. Can I ask the listing agent, how many offers do you have? Yes. Do they have to answer? No. But if they can just say, I'm not going to answer the question. But if they're going to say, yeah, I got some other offers, that's not a good enough answer. They would have to say, I have 6 other offers, and 2 of them are for my own buyers. So they have to either answer and say, I'm not going to tell you anything, or if they're going to tell you anything about other offers they got, they have to tell you exactly how many and if any of them are from their own office, okay? Then you ask them, how much is your other offers? Do they have to tell you that? No. Can they tell you that? Yes. Don't they need the sellers? Of course they need their seller's permission, but they don't need the buyers who made these offers permission to tell somebody else how much the other buyer offered. The only time they can't do that would be if the buyer submitted a confidentiality form before they submitted their offer and the seller agreed not to disclose the terms of their offer. Okay. So this is the type of stuff we're hearing. Are there any questions, Danny, do you think? Or are we good here?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
I have a question.
Okay, Dan.
Yeah, so my question is, the form for the love letter, what form is that?
Okay, there's a form called the Fair Housing Advisory and Disclosure. Now it's automatically pre-attached to the purchase contract. And it's automatically pre-attached to the listing contract. So if you take a listing, make sure your seller signs it and point them to paragraph 8, which talks about the letters. If you're representing a buyer, get them to sign it. It's attached to the purchase contract and point them to paragraph 8. Say, look what it says here about these letters.
Okay,
Bottom line is you sort of have a dialogue with your client. Says, these letters might not be a good idea. They add to the risk of a seller. The seller might not look at them. Listing agent, you may advise your seller not to look. And by the way, though, it's not illegal. I mean, if the seller says, thank you, I understand the risk, I still want to see the letter. It's not up for you to say, I can't show you the letter. You know what I mean? It's their letter. But the advice is, the form and the advice, the C.A.R.'s advice is to try to discourage your sellers from, if they get a letter, discourage them from reading it because it adds to their liability, their potential liability.
and the buyer, and the other way around for the buyer?
Well, it's not that it adds to their liability. It's just that if the seller is sort of aware of this stuff, I mean, listing agent might put in the remarks, please don't submit letters. Or the buyer says, if I submit it may say the buyer, this letter might backtrack. This seller may hold it against you that you submitted this letter that you weren't supposed to do. You know what I mean?
Right,
But I mean, still people can do what they want.
okay,
If the buyer wants to submit the letter, they're going to submit a letter. And if the seller wants to see it, they're going to see it. You've
Right.
done your job. You've given them this form. You've pointed out the risk.
okay,
They still want to do it. They can do it.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Gov, what's the latest on the new RPA that was supposed to have been released a year ago?
Yes. End of December, everybody, there is going to be a new purchase contract. Now, it's not going to be substantively different. It's just going to look a lot different. I refuse to look at it until it's finalized. It's not even finalized. But once it is finalized, I'm going to be the one giving a lot of classes in August, September, October, November, getting ready for the release so everyone understands the form. So it's coming out end of December.
And can you come out a few of the 20 pages that are proposed?
I think it's 16 now, but and by the way, how you're wondering, how did it go from 10 pages to 16? Because basically there's going to be sort of, the way I guess to look at it is going to be sort of a 3-page sort of summary of the big form. Because people don't read the whole form anyway, right? So it's better if you have a little bit of a summary that summarizes where all the deadlines are and all the contingencies are. So you don't have to go randomly looking for it. Seriously, I'm not going to study this form until it's all done because they keep changing it. So all I know is I'm going to be the one teaching the classes and it's coming out in December.
Okay, great.
Carol, have a question?
Carol, question?
I have a question. On the 55 plus, you said that you could buy something 3 times. Is the base property tax based on the the original, that 200K in your example? Or is it going to be based on, okay, I buy the $800,000 property, it's going to now be based on the 800,000?
Yeah, but yes, it's going to be based on the 800,000. But as you know, on the example I gave, your property tax basis on the 800,000 is going to be like 300,
It's true.
right? So but you're right. It's not going to be based on the original 200.
Okay.
Yeah, but obviously, if you buy a less expensive house, it's going to be the exact same.
Mhm.
It only goes up at all if you buy a more expensive house.
Okay. The other thing that came up that became a real conversation through Nextdoor had to do with the fact that the inheritance portion.
Yeah,
Oh my gosh, that was praised. That was like, don't vote for this because we won't be
yeah,
able to get the property tax base our parents have and all that. So,
yeah. Let me explain that part. You're right. The negative part of Prop 19 is that it took away most of the intergenerational exemption, transfer exemption from property tax reassessment. Let me explain what that means. Normally, as you know, when a property changes hands, it gets reassessed at the current fair market value. Obviously, the good part of Prop 19 says this doesn't happen if you're over 55 or disabled. It doesn't go up just because it changed ownership. It's still low. So that's good news. The bad news is not forever, but for quite a long time now, I forget how long, 20, 30 years, transfers between parents and children or grandparents and grandchildren did not trigger a reassessment. That hasn't been true forever, but it's been true since Prop 58, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago. Now, though, a transfer between parent-child or grandparent-grandchild, so it used to be you could transfer your primary residence and $1 million worth of additional real estate. Well, the $1 million is gone. Now you can only transfer a primary residence to avoid reassessment. And that only works is if the recipient continues to use it as their primary residence. The only thing I can tell you is, even if Prop 19 didn't happen, it looked very strongly that this was going to go away anyway. The legislature was already moving to eliminate all property tax reassessments for intergenerational transfers. If you look at it that way, at least you can still transfer your primary residence to your kid if they're going to use it as that. What if you got 3 kids? Do they all have to live together? No, they don't have to all live together. One of them has to live there. What if you transfer it to your kid and they live there for 10 years and then they want to move? Well, it's going to get reassessed in 10 years. In other words, it's only doesn't get reassessed for as long as they use it as their primary. Okay.
okay, so for the first so many years, my property tax base is going to be exactly what my parents had, for instance.
As long as it's your primary residence, yes.
Okay, got it. All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions that we have from the Zoom members?
Another one on the transfers is who's tracking all of the transfers? Obviously, counties don't talk to each other. So is it just based on IRS filings? Like, how are they going to know
You mean
somebody?
these for portability of the property tax?
Right.
They're working on that. They're working on a system for the counties to work together and use the same paperwork. Right now, every county has their own unique paperwork. So you're right. They should have had that ready by April 1st. They didn't. But details, we're waiting to see how exactly it's gonna be. You know, the ideal is it's going to be uniform. Every county is going to have the same form for for transferring properties and moving your property tax from one to another. Bottom line is, to do this, you buy a house. If you want to, it doesn't happen automatically. The buyer, the homeowner, has to file a form at their county assessor's office asking for the transfer of the property tax from their current home to the new home. There's a form they have to fill out right now. Each county has their own. The idea is, would be nice if every county had the same one, since you can go between counties this way. All I can tell you is we'll let you know as soon as we know more. But right now, if I did it today, I would go to my county and say, the law is in effect, I want to do it. And they have to make it happen. They have to make it happen. How they're going to make it happen, I don't know, but they have to make it happen. So that's a very good question, though. We'll see.
Gov, thank you. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Really appreciate you coming to see us. Thank
My
you.
pleasure. See you next
All right.
time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
I don't know
you.
about the rest of you, but I think Idaho is looking better every day here.
Yeah, Idaho does sound good. Okay, bye, everybody.
All right, so remember Mike, we got Mike Lukert in Idaho. A couple other things, I just want to remind you that we started Lisa as our transaction coordinator, only $275 if you're interested in having her help you with the paperwork and getting paid on time when your file is complete. And lastly, our lunch and learns every Thursday via Zoom. Tomorrow, it's going to be Joe Spear. That's our attorney's son, that's the architect, and he's going to talk about, what's he talking about?
Plans.
Oh, pre-plans, but I'm sure he'll get into ADUs and the cost of making these additions and remodelings on homes for you or for your client. Okay, so for those that are here, beer, donuts, and birthday cake. Happy birthday to those that have birthdays in April. Thank you very much for attending. Make it a great day. Thank you, guys.
A lot of new laws coming in.
What?
You know, the attorneys in Sacramento, they just love the county.